Currently, I'm mostly working on two separate fields. Number one is classical immunohematology and investigations that relate to the clinical work with patients who have some problems with platelets. So platelet-related disorders. This is my regular routine work. However, I still continue the research which started about 30 years ago on the stem cells, and it slowly developed from the hematopoietic stem cells, or better said, embryonic stem cells, into the stem cells of adult, and then to the adult embryonic-like stem cells, which further developed into the research of use of young stem cells for rejuvenation of old animals and human. So I'm currently working mostly on those two topics, the rejuvenation and the routine work with the platelets. The blood transfusion is actually the oldest form of cellular therapies and transplantation. It started in the Middle Ages. Well, it only developed well in the 20th century after the discovery of blood groups by a certain guy who lived in Vienna, and his name was Karl Landsteiner. So he was awarded the Nobel Prize for these discoveries later on in 1930. Maybe I could stress one interesting fact. The team he had in 1900 in Vienna consisted of Austro-Hungarian doctors and also laboratory workers. So in the team there were one Dr. Stork, one Dr. Sturli, but also one laboratory engineer Caric, and also one Slovenian doctor called Janez Plečnik. So he was a very young doctor, and after these discoveries in Vienna, he came back to Ljubljana, where he was a founder of Slovenian medical faculty. In 1920, he became the first professor of anatomy and pathology and also a dean of this. So he was the first person in the world in whom blood group B was discovered and confirmed, this Dr. Plečnik. Anyway, blood transfusion only started seriously after the Second World War, after those big combats when the blood was somehow realized to save lives. And I would say mass transfusions started after that, 1945. If you deal with a blood transfusion, there are always two possibilities. You can just use it for a passive supplement of lost blood. But you can also use it for an active treatment, because the blood contains very different cells, and among them are also cells which are alive. And these are the lymphocytes, or leukocytes better said, and among them are also the stem cells. And the stem cells are not given passively, you can use them actively. You can transplant the whole blood, bone marrow, to another person. And this is how it started. It all started in the 50s after the discovery that bone marrow transplant can revive or keep a man with leukemia alive. Or even better, it can keep alive the people who receive that atomic bomb irradiation. And normally you die after 14 to 20 days. your blood stops developing, producing, and you die in horrible pain after 20 to 30 days. With a transplantation from another person, you can achieve full recovery. And this is so to say, this is the function of the bone marrow. So blood doesn't start in the blood, in the veins and the arteries. It starts in the bone marrow, and a normal scientist would always come to the root of the problems. And the root of problems can be healed by using cells in an active way, not just as a supplement. This was also my story. I started as a transfusion medicine specialist, like collecting blood, preserving blood, and giving the blood to a patient. But that's not all. You can do much more. If you deal with the cells, you can actively participate in the healing. And the cells from the bone marrow, or there is a huge, I would say, jungle of problems and things in the bone marrow. And if you start doing this, you normally end up with the cells, stem cells, the stem cell use for treatment of different diseases, and you probably finish nowadays with the gene therapy, because the stem cells are the best vector for gene therapy. And gene therapy is, of course, the most modern way of therapies in the current medicine. Well, when we did our initial research on stem cells, we discovered that in various therapies, not only the longevity, the effect of stem cell transplantation is much, much better in the case when the donor is a young person, or in case of the animals, when the bone marrow is taken from a very young individual and transfused or transplanted to an old animal. So the results of such therapies are much better. For instance, in Europe there has been several hundred thousands of bone marrow transplantation for leukemia patients since 1970s, 1980s. And when the huge meta-analyses were performed recently, they realized then the success rate of that therapy is much better if the donor is a very young person. Similarly, in different animal studies, many different authors have shown the results of transplanting young stem cells into an old individual. This is scientifically called heterochrome principle. If you take some cells which are young and put it into an old person, or some other substances, and they noticed a healing effect of this therapy. So also in our investigations, we aimed at that part. However, it is very hard to do it in humans. Why? Because we live too long. So if you want to prove the principle in a human, you must take his young stem cells, freeze it for 50 years, and then prove the principle by rejuvenating the old one with his own cells. If you don't do that, you come up with a problem, because the transplantation from heterologic person, from another person, is not possible unless they are HLA completely compatible, and this is impossible to achieve. So the autologous transplantation is the only feasible in that context. So if I wanted to prove this principle, I would have to live another 80 years or so, which is probably not possible. So we did the research on short-living animal models. And the short-living laboratory animals, which are the cheapest and the most affordable, are mice. And mice are good example and good model for transplantation related scientific questions since ever. So we did the research, which we started in 2012, 13, 14, on long-living mice. And the several projects were made on mice, and several articles have been published, and my group is still working on it. We came to several interesting discoveries and scientific data. So the problem ended, our research partially ended in 2020 due to the COVID epidemics. We lost some money, we lost the collaborators, but on the other hand, the COVID brought an interesting issue. It namely showed that allogeneic approach is also possible. So the stem cells do not need to be strictly autologous. You can use the allogeneic stem cells, but in that case, you cannot use the hematopoietic stem cells, but you can use another group of stem cells. So not the hematopoietic part, but the stem cells which also reside in different parts of the body, also the bone marrow, but also different tissues. And these cells can be used throughout your life, but of course still they are the best if they are very young. So the donor of these cells can be universal, but very young. And they grow very good in huge numbers, so you can produce them in a commercial way. Those cells are called mesenchymal stem cells. And they are now available. Some of them are already registered by the FDA and EMA. And they will probably develop into the universal rejuvenating cells after they become more popular and cheaper, of course. The production at the moment is extremely cheap. Extremely expensive. Yeah. So the one therapy in the current scenarios is probably impossible to be paid by any insurance. So it is only possible to the very wealthy people, which I personally do not support because that limits the efficacy of medicine. I was a little bit disappointed after the funding of our research projects and programs that were related to prevention of old age-related immune defects, which can be healed by the stem cells, stopped. So currently, I would say not only Slovenia, but the whole Europe is underestimating the demographic role of these therapies. The population is getting older. We have in 2060, we will have more old people than young people in Europe. And that brings a huge problem to the health systems in terms of spending a lot of money for chronic diseases of old age, whereas we could invest a little more in prevention of these diseases and in expanding our active life period. And this prevention of aging would bring much better financial effects to the health system than just curing the old and very diseased people. I'm afraid that not only Slovenia, but all European countries are missing the main target. They should invest more into that prevention. That's a very interesting but also a very popular question. I keep on getting those questions since many years because blood transfusion related questions were one of the first put on the menu of so-called environmentalists and healthy style promoters and so on. The question which they posed was actually, how does your blood group ABO relate to your constitution and what you should eat and how you should lose weight and how does it relate to your temperament, to your psyche, and whom do you have to marry, which blood group, lady or husband? That's very popular in Japan. I worked myself in Japan in 1990s and they kept on thinking that the ABO blood group relates to different sociological, psychological science. Even the feeding, taking the food should be or could be related to ABO blood groups. Well, unfortunately, those theories are a full miss. Namely, the authors of that first theories were some scientists in the United States in the 1950s. That was Peter D'Adamo and his, I believe his father, or is it vice versa? The old Peter D'Adamo and his son, they made the whole industry based on ABO blood group related, how one should eat, how one should train, and so forth and so forth. And they were selling those books in billions, and they're still popular all around. However, they're now scientifically disproved completely. The ABO blood groups do not relate to any of those, how I would put, physiological scenarios. Namely, the ABO blood groups were developed in the evolution much earlier than the man himself. We can find them in the very simple organisms. We can find them in our ancestors, and we can even find them in apes, all kinds of apes, gorilla, chimpanzee, and so forth. So the theory they posed was that the blood groups started from some Homo sapiens, and when he stopped living in jungle and started producing tools and doing with crops, all of a sudden blood group O started, and now the blood group O should eat oats and bread and things like that. So all the theories they produced in those years were later somehow disproven by appearance of modern genetic. And modern genetic analysis showed that there is no relation to the ABO blood groups and any of the characteristics they wanted to show. So it's not only useless to eat according to your type, it can be bad for your health, especially for the young children. So the theories for the other haplotypes contributing to some special characteristics is probably false as well, because these genetic traits of blood groups and HLA type and other are nothing else just like your other characteristics, the color of your eye. Like I would say the blue-eyed people should eat, I don't know, milk. It has no scientific proof and also not any relative strength. As I already noticed, the COVID era completely changed the whole range of supposed ideas. For instance, the rejuvenation was not thought about as a possibility without autologous approach. However, in the COVID era, we have seen that millions of people underwent the COVID infection, and 10,000s and 100,000s of them have been treated by the mesenchymal stem cells in order to bring down the immune reaction that comes with the COVID. COVID-19 makes a huge immune disaster into a patient. And the cytokine storm that develops eventually can cause the so-called acute respiratory distress syndrome, which puts you in grave, actually. So after this huge pneumonia develops, there is no way back. And there is very little medicines developed which can help you. In spite of artificial breathing and everything, as soon as that immune reaction was so strong, the people have started dying. And mesenchymal stem cells were used in large numbers, and they brought down this immune reaction, and many of them managed to survive. And there was no side effects. There was no graft versus host disease. There was no rejection reactions. So in thousands and thousands of cases, the scientists have documented the good effect of mesenchymal stem cells. Of course, those mesenchymal stem cells do not home into the host. They just exert some beneficial effects which are beneficial in the old man. Namely, they counteract to the chronic inflammation on one hand, and they also bring about or bring into the organism some beneficial factors. We call them factors of growth and regeneration, and help in regenerative potential of your own old stem cells. At the beginning, we were unprepared, but the blood service, not only in Slovenia, but in the whole Western world, Europe, United States, and other developed countries, reacted very fast. And there was actually no shortages of blood, because the people showed a lot of solidarity. It is like a natural, I would say, natural disaster. And they developed new ways of promoting the blood donation. So in Slovenia, I must say, there hasn't been a single case that a patient wouldn't get the blood he needed. And it was similarly in the Western Europe. And based on that experience, the countries developed their own disaster programs. So I think we are ready for any new wave of infection in the future. Well, absolutely, I think so, because especially if you start very young, the best is you must start when you are born. So you must keep your placental blood frozen for yourself, because you will need it, not in the first 20 years. The chances of getting leukemia in the first 20 years and storing the cord blood for that purpose are less than 0.04%. But the chances of you getting old and needing your own stored stem cells for rejuvenation, for the immune improvement and other things are 100%, because you will get old sooner or later, and that would be the best solution. However, the people do not store their blood from the placenta. Placentas are thrown away. That's a big waste. So the second option is to store your own blood when you are 18 or 20 years old or so. So you have to collect your bone marrow, which can be done painlessly with the apheresis procedure, and then store it for a couple of 10 years, and then you can use it. So that can be done, but it is not supported by the health insurance. So it can be only done privately, in the private organization, in the private companies. And there are very few of them in the world. The procedure still hasn't been totally acknowledged and confirmed and so forth. In Slovenia, we have one company doing that. I know the guy who did it the first in the world, at least to my knowledge, because that was me. I did it to prove the principle, although I was too old. I was already 60 when I collected my own bone marrow stem cells, just to see how the procedure would go. Now that's 10 years ago, and of course that won't make any big help to me. But if I did it when I was 18 years, I would be more optimistic regarding this method. To keep your old blood young, that's very hard to do. There are two possibilities. You can either use some therapies, some special foods, vitamins, and so forth, or there is another way of living healthy, which is prevention by healthy methods like enough sleeping, not exaggerate in sleeping, for instance, while you are driving. I mean, enough sleeping during the night, and like eating healthy, not smoking, training, keeping fit, and so forth. Everybody knows this method. So another possibility is to rely on pharmaceuticals, and we have many people who are doing this or even combining it, because staying healthy for a long time is now kind of optimum or optimal wish of people in the developed world. I would say that it's probably the biggest wish of them all. A few years ago and many years, maybe some other ideals were there, like having many children or having a lot of money. But nowadays, the long life is probably number one. As far as I'm reading the current scientific papers, they still expect further infections and further epidemics to come, because the world is getting smaller and the viruses replicate extremely fast and the evolution goes on. So I believe that we will be the aim of new infections and of new epidemics. That has always been a case, namely, except that we didn't commute so much. For instance, the epidemics in Africa made the whole evolution of people based on the resistance to Plasmodium falciparum. So the whole generations died out, and only the ones who were who could respond to it survived. And the same was in Spanish flu in 1920 and many others. And this is just the one of epidemics in the history of mankind. And it will develop further on. And as we saw in the COVID case, the survival of the fittest is still working in human evolution. And being fit means being fit immune, in your immune resilience, and in your also, I would say, psychological resilience, and some other, like living in proper conditions. Therefore, I would say that the COVID-19 taught us to take good care of our resilience, and the immune resilience can be assisted by these cellular therapies a lot.